Donald Trump's relationship with international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank has been characterized by implicit criticism, controversial actions, and policy choices that suggest skepticism towards their roles in global governance. One notable action was Trump's 2019 appointment of David Malpass as World Bank president. Malpass, a vocal critic of the World Bank, had questioned its effectiveness and lending programs, particularly its financial support to China, which he considered inappropriate for a country with substantial financial and economic resources. This appointment was widely interpreted as a reflection of Trump's broader skepticism towards multilateral institutions and an attempt to align the World Bank with his America First agenda. This move signaled an effort to challenge the status quo in international development financing and reduce U.S. contributions to global financial efforts. Trump's America First philosophy strained multilateral institutions, including the IMF and the World Bank. His administration frequently expressed concern that these institutions benefited other nations, particularly China, at the expense of the United States. Reports from the Associated Press indicated that a potential second Trump term might have included proposals for the United States to withdraw entirely from the IMF and the World Bank. This idea gained traction within conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, which proposed an overhaul of U.S. foreign aid and international financial commitments. Such a withdrawal would reflect the belief that these institutions are unnecessary intermediaries that drain U.S. resources while benefiting foreign governments. The Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 introduced proposals to reassess U.S. involvement in international organizations, including the IMF. These proposals garnered significant attention due to their potential implications for U.S. global leadership and international financial stability. Central to Project 2025 is the idea that the United States should reconsider its engagement with multilateral institutions like the IMF, with some advocating for complete withdrawal. Proponents argue that the IMF acts as an expensive intermediary, channeling U.S. taxpayer money to foreign governments without sufficient accountability or transparency. They claim that by withdrawing, the United States could prioritize domestic financial needs and redirect international assistance through bilateral channels, which they perceive as more effective and controlled. This perspective reflects a broader skepticism of multilateral institutions embedded in Project 2025's philosophy, which advocates for a realignment of U.S. priorities to focus on sovereignty and domestic strengthening. Critics of the IMF within the Project 2025 framework believe that the institution's operations diminish U.S. influence by pooling resources from multiple nations, thereby limiting direct control over how funds are allocated and used. Significant opposition from both domestic and international stakeholders exists regarding potential U.S. withdrawal from the International Monetary Fund, IMF. U.S. Treasury officials, such as Jay Shamba, have openly criticized the idea, describing it as a move that would undermine U.S. economic security and influence. They argue the IMF is a vital tool for ensuring global financial stability, which ultimately benefits the United States by fostering stable international markets crucial for American businesses and investments. Furthermore, they emphasize that U.S. leadership within the IMF allows it to shape international financial policies, giving it a strategic edge in global economic affairs. On a broader scale, the proposal to reduce U.S. involvement in the IMF raises concerns about the potential impact on global financial stability. The IMF plays a central role in managing financial crises, providing emergency funding and supporting economic recovery in developing and emerging economies. A U.S. withdrawal could weaken the institution's ability to respond to crises, create a leadership vacuum, and lead to greater instability in the international financial system. The recommendations from Project 2025 reflect a significant shift in how the United States might approach global financial institutions, emphasizing a retreat from multilateralism in favor of domestic priorities and bilateral relationships. While this aligns with the project's overarching goals of reducing reliance on international organizations, it raises complex questions about the long-term consequences for U.S. influence and the global economy. Ultimately, the tension between sovereignty and international cooperation lies at the heart of the debate surrounding Project 2025's vision for the IMF and other global institutions. The potential U.S. withdrawal from the IMF and World Bank could unexpectedly align with long-standing critiques from the Global South, particularly the BRICS nations, who have called for reforms to these institutions. Many countries in the Global South view the IMF and World Bank as instruments of Western dominance, often criticizing their loan conditions for imposing austerity and privatization measures that interfere with domestic policies and harm recipient economies. BRICS, in particular, has pushed for a more equitable global financial order and developed alternatives like the New Development Bank to challenge these institutions' influence. If the U.S. were to exit, it would weaken the Western grip on these institutions and might indirectly support BRICS' objectives of restructuring the global financial system. Such a move could create space for reforms or further strengthen alternative mechanisms led by the Global South. Trump's criticism of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank should also be seen in the context of his broader distrust of multilateral organizations, including NATO, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations. In his view, such organizations often acted against U.S. interests or failed to provide the United States with a fair return on its investments. Public statements directly targeting the IMF or the World Bank by Trump are relatively rare. Some of his broader comments about international organizations can be interpreted as criticism of their role. For example, in a 2020 press conference, Trump reiterated his skepticism toward foreign aid and international institutions, saying the U.S. should focus on its own economic challenges rather than financing global projects were cited. In criticizing global financial systems, he implied that the U.S. was being exploited through unfair trade deals, lending policies, or global aid programs, many of which intersect with the missions of the IMF and the World Bank. The World Bank, or arguably the U.S. Bank since its inception in 1944, has had leadership exclusively chosen from the United States. This custom reveals a long-standing bias that diminishes the institution's trustworthiness, particularly in its interactions with the Global South, the very regions it purports to support. From the first president, Eugene Meyer, to the current leader, A.J. Banga, the World Bank has upheld a tradition where its president is invariably an American national. This unspoken rule highlights the United States' dominance within the organization, reinforced by its status as the largest stakeholder. This practice has significant repercussions. An American-dominated leadership implies inherent favoritism toward the United States' economic and political agendas. Decisions regarding development funding and structural reforms often reflect a neoliberal stance preferred by Western nations. This stance has been criticized for imposing austerity and privatization policies that tend to increase inequality and hinder sustainable growth in the Global South. The lack of diversity at the top sustains the perception of the World Bank as a Western tool rather than a truly international body. For nations in the Global South, which make up most of its beneficiaries, the absence of leadership that mirrors their experiences and perspectives raises concerns about equitable representation. U.S. dominance in leadership ensures that the institution's policies are more aligned with Western strategic objectives than with the specific needs of beneficiary countries. For example, World Bank projects have often been criticized for prioritizing resource extraction or trade liberalization that benefits multinational corporations over initiatives that address local development needs. The IMF has been a key global financial institution since its 1944 founding, with a consistent European leadership. From the first managing director, Camille Goutte, to current head Kristalina Georgieva, Europeans have dominated the role, reflecting Western fiscal priorities like austerity, privatization, and liberalization. This long-standing trend has reinforced an institutional bias toward advanced European economies, sidelining the needs of developing nations. Despite its global reach, the IMF's leadership does not represent the diversity of its member countries. The U.S. and Europe's shared leadership roles have centralized power within the Western Bloc, excluding Asia, Africa, and Latin America. BRICS leaders advocating for reforms have criticized the IMF for failing to implement changes like the 2010 reforms, undermining its legitimacy. In October 2024, Russian Finance Minister Anton Silvanov declared the IMF and the World Bank are not fulfilling their roles and are not acting in the interests of BRICS countries. He advocated for the creation of new institutions tailored to BRICS' interests, suggesting that the current global financial system is dominated by Western nations and does not sufficiently serve BRICS countries. Additionally, at the 15th BRICS Summit in Kazan, Russia, in October 2024, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva stated that the group's new development bank, NDB, was intended as an alternative to what he called failing Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF. He highlighted the necessity for BRICS nations to develop alternative payment methods, indicating a desire to lessen dependence on traditional Western-controlled financial systems. Why are countries dissatisfied with financial institutions like the IMF? A fair loan offers reasonable terms that support sustainable growth without overburdening the borrower, with features like fair interest rates, flexible repayment, transparency, and a focus on long-term development. Unfair loans, on the other hand, impose high interest rates, rigid terms, and strict policy requirements, often leading to economic strain and loss of sovereignty. The IMF promotes macroeconomic stabilization through austerity measures, privatization, and deregulation, but its one-size-fits-all approach can harm national sovereignty, increase poverty, and perpetuate debt dependency. In contrast, the BRICS New Development Bank, established in 2015, offers more flexible, borrower-friendly terms focused on infrastructure, renewable energy, and sustainable projects. It emphasizes regional cooperation and economic autonomy, but faces challenges in ensuring equal representation among BRICS nations. The BRICS countries are pushing for reforms to make the IMF and WTO frameworks more representative of the Global South. They seek changes like increasing emerging economies' influence and restoring the WTO's dispute resolution mechanism. These efforts reflect a broader push to overhaul the Western-dominated financial system and explore alternative institutions. This video examines the dissatisfaction with the IMF and the negative impact of its loans on Global South countries. Let's dive in. Which BRICS or Global South nations have suffered negative impacts from IMF loans and the policies they enforced? Let's analyze each country's case of IMF loans and their consequences. Let's take a quick pause. If you've enjoyed the video so far, could we ask a small favor? Hitting the like button helps us reach a broader audience, and sharing your thoughts or feedback in the comments makes an even bigger impact. Thank you for watching. Now let's dive back in. By the mid-1980s, Nigeria faced economic decline with falling oil revenues, rising debt, and dwindling reserves. Under General Babangida, the country launched a Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, in 1986, with IMF support to diversify the economy and reduce fiscal deficits. However, currency devaluation, subsidy cuts, and austerity measures led to inflation, unemployment, and public outcry. Anti-SAP riots erupted in May 1989, starting at the University of Benin and spreading nationwide. The government's military crackdown resulted in casualties and arrests, further eroding public trust. Despite intended reforms, SAP worsened poverty and inequality, leaving a lasting impact on Nigeria's economy and political stability. The Asian financial crisis plunged Indonesia into economic turmoil, with the rupiah collapsing and inflation surging. In 1997, Suharto's government secured a $43 billion IMF bailout, sparking unrest over austerity policies. By May 1998, protests turned violent, with widespread looting and attacks targeting the Chinese community. Over 1,000 fatalities were reported as military forces suppressed dissent. Mounting pressure forced Suharto to resign on May 21, 1998, after 31 years in power, marking the start of the Reformasi era. The crisis left a deep societal and economic impact, shaping Indonesia's approach to international financial institutions. In January 1977, Egypt's decision to cut food subsidies under IMF pressure triggered the bread riots. Sharp price hikes in staples like bread and sugar sparked nationwide protests starting on January 18th, led by workers and later joined by students and citizens. Rioters targeted police stations, government offices, and public transport, causing significant property damage. President Sadat deployed the military on January 20th, resulting in around 80 deaths and over 1,200 arrests. Facing public backlash, the government reinstated subsidies to restore order, highlighting the social costs of abrupt economic reforms. In the late 1990s, Brazil faced a severe economic crisis, prompting a $41.5 billion IMF aid package in 1998, contingent on strict austerity measures such as public spending cuts, tax hikes, and structural reforms. These policies reduced funding for healthcare, education, and social security, disproportionately affecting vulnerable populations and sparking nationwide protests and strikes. Critics argued the austerity measures deepened poverty and inequality, while supporters credited them with stabilizing the economy, curbing hyperinflation, and restoring investor confidence. Brazil's early repayment of IMF loans in 2005 under President Lula da Silva signaled improved economic independence, though debates over the social costs of IMF policies persist. In 1981, Morocco's removal of food subsidies under IMF-mandated austerity led to a 76% surge in staple prices and widespread discontent. The Casablanca bread riots on May 29 saw thousands protest, targeting symbols of wealth, while government forces violently suppressed dissent, leaving 637 dead. The unrest underscored the fragile balance between economic reform and social stability in a subsidy-reliant society. Similarly, in 1989, Venezuela's IMF-driven austerity measures, including fare hikes and economic reforms, triggered El Caracazo, mass protests and riots starting February 27. The military's violent crackdown killed 275,000 people and eroded trust in the government. This crisis paved the way for Hugo Chávez's rise, illustrating the volatile impact of abrupt economic adjustments on deeply divided societies. These events highlight the complex interplay between international financial aid, domestic policy, and the socio-economic challenges of affected populations.